In the past, we've had one of the leaders on the coalition in our earlier stages, Judge Gray, organization formerly known as Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. They've rebranded themselves a little bit, and now they call themselves the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. Joining me on the phone, dialing in, taking time from his busy Friday evening, is Jason Thomas. Jason, welcome for the first time to the coalition.
Well, thank you. Very excited to be on today. Thanks for having me on.
Great. Now let's talk about LEAP a little bit. First of all, how long have you been involved with the organization?
I joined LEAP in 2011, and I've been an active part since, especially during the campaign to pass Amendment 64, which is Colorado's recreational marijuana laws.
Right. Tell us a little bit about the organization, its origins, and where it is today.
Sure. So LEAP started in Washington, D.C. It was a small group of current and former law enforcement officers, judges, and district attorneys. And what they saw was the significant injustice on how our drug laws are written and applied, and then how that impacts our society negatively, as opposed to being, positive catalyst for change or positive benefits by virtue of locking up mass incarceration. So since its founding, LEAP has grown to over 100,000 supporters worldwide. We have hundreds of speakers, just like myself, that I'm a former law enforcement officer and worked in both county jail and on patrol. So having seen the drug war from the inside and that it's just not working, has given me and my colleagues the opportunity to speak out against the drug war in forums like this.
Great. Let's kind of go over, and we'll have a little refresher course here, because we often talk about what I call the failed war on drugs, the generational failure that is the war on drugs. Here on the show, we've had folks from Regulate RI, from the Libertarian Party, Judge Jim Gray from LEAP, all sorts of perspectives from within the city, within the African American community, within the ACLU. LEAP, of course, what's unique about them is you did serve as a detention officer, and you have been a deputy marshal, and much like your members in the organization nationwide, you've actually served on the streets, on the mean streets, if you will, and you've seen the other side, the real impact, whether it be through incarceration or through repeated arrests of the war on drugs on individuals in the flesh. This is by no means an abstract for you, is it?
It's not. No, this is based on my own experience. Things that I had to address as a detention officer, things that I saw. I worked in a small community, in a rural community, and so we saw a lot of repeat offenders. And I would say that the vast majority of those that were incarcerated were involved in some sort of either drug crime or were charged with a drug crime. But seeing it from the inside, it's something that lends a very unique perspective. Law enforcement is one of the toughest professions you could have. But what people see on the outside and they don't see within the inner workings of the department is really what happens when the laws are applied unjustly. And you had mentioned the drug war. The Nixon administration started the drug war back in 1972, and they funded the DEA and started the DEA. But that was really when the war on drugs started, with the passage of the Controlled Substances Act and subsequent new laws that were written to address this growing drug problem. But in the past 40 or some years, it's been proven that our drug laws are archaic. They're written slanted toward or against minorities and people of color. And so now it's really a matter of changing those, starting with changing perception and understanding by people of really what it is.
One need only go back to that epic moment when Richard Nixon was portrayed alongside the king himself, that renowned drug warrior, Elvis Presley, to understand the farcical nature, if you will, of the war on drugs. And I say that with the perspective of it having been so damaging on so many different levels. And yet the irony is rife. The Republican Party that brought us, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the war on drugs and the EPA, the DEA, both organizations epic failures in their own right. But what's wrong with the war on drugs? Why don't we want to have a war on drugs? I mean, it sounds like such a great idea. What's gone wrong?
Well, what's gone wrong is that it comes down to the laws that have been written and put together. I think much like our tax code, they've gotten so cumbersome and so convoluted and complicated. Then there have been some significant changes, through the years. Mandatory minimum sentencing for drug offenders is a significant issue. People that are arrested for low-level drug crimes, whether it be marijuana or possession of small amounts of other drugs, they're having to go to prison for 5, 10, or more years, even though there was no violence in the crime. There may not have even been anything but more than simple possession. Mm-hmm. So really the drug laws, they've come together, and as they've coalesced, it's really created more problems through their application than it's solving. Because drug abuse, and the drug issues we face, in as much as it's a law enforcement issue, it's really a social justice and public safety issue. Mm-hmm. So instead of addressing it strictly as this is a law enforcement issue only, we need to look at it and step back and say, well, there are some bad people that should be put in prison, should be convicted, but higher number, more people, are not being treated fairly within the system. And so correcting that, through changing our drug laws, but also through more harm reduction strategies, I think is a more appropriate response.
What impact does incarceration have, from your real-world perspective, on people who perpetrated essentially victimless crimes? That was the use of narcotics, the use of cannabis in an environment that was self-contained and have not involved no one else, did not involve use of a motor vehicle. I mean, ultimately, this is a product that folks chose to use themselves, were arrested for. What does that do to their family structure? What does that do to their ability to earn a living? What does that do to them as a human being?
Well, at the very least, it complicates their lives. If you're charged with a felony, that will follow you on your job applications forever. It's something you'll always have to disclose. But, even for a short while, that disrupts their whole family. And you're right that people who get involved in drugs in whatever way, whatever level, made a choice more or less to go that direction. So it's not to take the blame or potential culpability off the person that's incarcerated. Mm-hmm. But the impacts, taking the breadwinner out of the family, less stability, the issues just start going down the line once you really start looking at it.
Right, and this is what's interesting about this is compare this to alcohol. Both are mind-altering substances, as Tony and I can attest to on a regular basis. But with one, you're jailing people for the simple use of it. In alcohol, which is more, air quote, acceptable, you're only jailing people if they abuse it in a manner which causes harm to other people. Why in the year 2017 do we have such a dichotomy between the use in the, well, let's just take marijuana, for example, and the use of a natural product, again, harming no one. Why does that dichotomy exist in terms of its relationship to law enforcement? Is there any reason?
Well, there's a number of dynamics behind it. The recent push over the last 7 years to legalize marijuana on a broad scale, starting state by state, it's a very new phenomenon. And so states, governments, law enforcement agencies, they've had to figure out if it's federally illegal, but this state has legalized it, what does that mean and how do we apply it to the current laws? But when you look at marijuana and contrast that to alcohol, alcohol kills people every day, whether it's overdose intoxication, whether it's car accidents, whether it's violent crimes, behind being drunk. Alcohol kills people. It destroys families. It's been proven. Now, marijuana, on the other hand, it's never been proven that it's killed anybody. It's been attributed to, handfuls, numbers of deaths as quote-unquote mitigating or aggravating circumstance. But the times that I've seen it, it's always been like 4th, 5th, 6th down the line of contributing factors. It's our society that needs to gain more acceptance of marijuana and its use, what it is, what isn't it. The reefer madness part of the drug war that started, with Nixon in the 70s, and then even before that with the real reefer madness. That's all just propaganda that our government has put out to scare people as a means to justify the law enforcement actions. And also just to say, you know what, this is evil, so you can't do it, which really goes against our democratic process.
Folks, if you're just joining us,
If
you're just joining us, you are listening. Oh, I'm sorry, buddy. Go right ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that, the use of marijuana or any drug or alcohol is really a personal choice. What we're facing now is a personal choice, states' rights, federal rights issue as it pertains to legalizing marijuana. So as more states adopt legalizing marijuana, more education is out there, the word's getting out that marijuana isn't an evil and it's actually a healthy alternative to other drugs or alcohol or other means that people try to quote unquote fix themselves.
Right. As we see in the opioid epidemic, there are clearly prescriptive uses of derivatives of marijuana that would in fact act as both in terms of pain remediation as well as ongoing research into potential life-saving aspects of it in treating neurological ailments like epilepsy, in treating cancer patients, and yet those efforts are stymied in large part because of the continued federal insistence on classifying that within the dreaded DEA list. If alcohol, on the other hand, I mean, are there any other than as a cleaning tool or as perhaps again an aid towards forgetfulness, if you will? Is there any beneficial aspect to alcohol whatsoever?
I believe there is. Alcohol is a drug, like all the others out there. I believe it was used for medicinal use back in probably until the 1900s when drug manufacturing started to become more popular. Does it have medicinal use? In my mind, for myself and my life, no. I can't see any medicinal value. May have some, certainly as an anesthetic. But alcohol has little redeeming value, in and of itself. Right.
Folks, if you're just joining us, you are in fact listening to the Coalition on the Worldwide Coalition Media Network. This segment is sponsored by iServices LLC, which of course can be found at iServicesLLC.com. Server management, virus detection, SEO, and other Facebook, social media, and internet marketing techniques, all available from your friends at iServicesLLC.com, covering the state of Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and beyond. Call the folks and Frank at iServices LLC. Of course, joining us in the studio, if you'll via phone, is Jason Thomas. He's a former corrections officer, a former deputy marshal, been involved in law enforcement in a very, very real sense, has seen firsthand the impact, if you will, of the war on drugs. This is a backdrop for the reason I asked Jason to come in tonight. We're discussing the recent release of a study focusing, I believe, on Colorado in the wake of the decision. Now, I guess we're a couple of years out from when the original voting took place of legalizing cannabis in Colorado. Now, as a backdrop, the reefer madness folks here in Rhode Island who argued again and again and again for more time, more study, many of whom those folks actually rely upon federal funding for anti-drug efforts for their own sustenance, ironically enough, continue to point to anecdotal evidence that would suggest that use of cannabis by young folks has risen in Colorado, making all sorts of extreme connections. You know, it mystifies me how it can continue to arrive at this. But now we're a couple of years out, if you will, and we're starting to see really the facts come down. I want to point out that in almost all cases nationwide, efforts to legalize cannabis have never encouraged the use of any type of drug or alcohol product by young people. And in the country, that still remains illegal for them to do so. Most legalization efforts were aimed at, quite bluntly, the frank realization that use amongst society was endemic to begin with, that the children of society have free and open access to cannabis at will through any one of a number of sources, obviously all black market, all illegal, that in fact recognizing that the cannabis supply through those channels was often doctored, dangerous, and perhaps riddled with all sorts of alternative substances which could have serious effects health-wise. Realizing all of that was the notion that in any case in failed prohibition, that the introduction, if you will, of the free market of a legal product would in fact encourage manufacturers to compete on quality as well as price. So let's talk about Colorado and what's going on with youth in America as now we've seen the impact of adults having legal access to cannabis. Give us a snapshot, if you will, of what the study is and who it's from and what it supports.
Sure. So the study was originally conducted in 2013, surveyed around 20,000 middle school and high schoolers. And the study centered around do they have a higher incidence of marijuana use, have access to marijuana, knowledge of marijuana, and so from 2013, they then conducted the study again, or had another study in 2014. What they found was that there was no increase in use rates of marijuana for children or greater access to it. It did find that the perception of will marijuana harm our kids and what's it going to do to the children has really been proven to be more of a fallacy, and just opinion and expectations have been set up as opposed to really being a contributing factor. So the report generally summarized that between 2013 and 2014, 2014 is when legal adult use sales of cannabis started in Colorado. There was really no change in higher incidence of use by teens and children.
Is there anything to suggest that, in fact, anywhere there has been an increase by youth? Because I guess on one level, young people had pretty much free and unfettered access to the product to begin with. Somehow we were led to believe, as in so many cases, and here in New England, to use another anecdote, when the passage of marriage equality finally took place in Massachusetts, that in fact free society as we knew it would crumble overnight. somehow the corollary is derived from folks who are anti-legalization, that an increase of young people took place into Denver, all streaming into the streets in search of legal cannabis. What do the statistics actually tell us?
Well, so the center of legalizing cannabis, and it really started with Colorado and the model that was adopted and is now in use, of keeping cannabis as a tightly and highly regulated industry and market. So it's actually taken quite a bit of the black market share of the marijuana distribution off the streets.
Mm-hmm.
Put that into regulated and highly scrutinized industry. You have to have your ID checked twice when you're in a store buying marijuana. There are very explicit rules on what you can and can't do. But since legalization's happened, there's been very few negative side effects, especially when compared to all the positive attributes. Areas that have high density of marijuana grow locations, because of their high security facilities and the nature of the industry, they've created a higher incidence of police drive-bys at times when these would have been fully deserted. And so it's really created stronger opportunities for our communities to say, you know what, we're going to take this out of the black market, we're going to control it, and have it within an operation that you have to do these things and prove you're an adult in order to buy it. And so it's really helped to curb the black market, and actually safeguard against our kids because they can't just go up to a buddy at school or a dealer on the street and buy marijuana that way.
Because what happens to a black market when, as long as the product, and by the way, full disclosure, as a libertarian, I would prefer to see no taxation on this whatsoever, but with some level of open market competition where people are competing on quality and price, what happens to the black market when all of a sudden you've got potentially thousands of legal outlets for the same product?
Well, it curbs it, and it's diminished the black market just strictly on a supply-demand basis.
Mm-hmm.
If you can disrupt supply-demand in an area, that's usually because there's a positive disruption from another area.
Mm-hmm.
And so, marijuana has never been legalized or regulated in our lifetimes. Until 1930 or thereabout. So what we're experiencing now is really unfounded in our lifetime. It's, the studies and the data that's out there is very thin in terms of its volume, just because the federal government hasn't allowed studies, to be conducted. It's just created a lot more benefit than not within our communities.
And let's look at those studies. I mean, we perform exhaustive studies in this country on the effects of legal products like tobacco and alcohol. Exhaustive studies, their impact on the healthcare system, their impact on the human body, physiologically, psychologically, mentally. At the same time, we look at the economic aspects of it routinely, and to a very large degree, one can argue that government relies on their sale for its own financial survival. We do all of that, and yet we continue to operate largely in ignorance at the government level, a studied ignorance, an intentional ignorance, if you will, of cannabis. It's bizarre. And as a result,
well,
yeah, go ahead.
It's a political hot potato. It's the kind of thing that we saw with President Obama, and at least to this point with President Trump, they've taken more of a hands-off approach in legalized states more than less.
Mm-hmm.
But so for politicians, it's first in. Do I want to make my mark in society and for my namesake that I'm the one that legalized marijuana? We haven't seen that one person come out, but it's an issue with Congress and the DEA and the Department of Justice Congress has defunded the DEA from using any of their resources to go into a state that has legalized marijuana for law enforcement actions unless they're invited in by the local jurisdiction. The DEA has said we're going to allow, we're going to issue licenses, and I believe there's 15 or 20 applications pending for research universities and other groups to study cannabis in various ways. The DEA has said, send us your application, we're going to review them, and if you meet the criteria, we'll issue a license. Well, now the Department of Justice won't review any of the applications and has spelled out the entire program. And so you look at the governing bodies that have some purview or jurisdiction over marijuana and its legalization, they're not on the same page. And it's just like a political hot potato, quite literally.
Right. What has the introduction of Jeff Sessions as Attorney General done to create a mature, facts-based discussion of the issue?
Yeah. Well, he rattled a lot of nerves and created a lot of discomfort when he came to office because he is such an anti-drug warrior. He's an archaic prohibitionist who relies on outdated data and doesn't understand the nuances and intricacies of the positive benefits of legalizing marijuana. At any point in time, the Department of Justice, the DEA, they can come in throughout the country and attempt to shut down the entire industry. Empirically, it would be impossible to do that en masse in any type of reasonable time frame. So knowing that the feds can come in at any time, that's always a specter that hangs over the industry. It's very uncomfortable to have Jeff Sessions as the Attorney General just because he's such a conservative on the issue and he relies on old, outdated data, for his views. Will they make any changes, one direction or another to federal marijuana policy or enforcement actions in states that have legalized marijuana? Who knows? It could happen, it may not happen. But frankly, the administration has such bigger fish to fry than trying to fight against legalizing marijuana, on a large scale. My personal belief is that they'll generally let it lie until they have to make a decision. And as every election passes now, will stay proven. And so it's a matter of time until we reach so much of a critical mass of states that have marijuana laws in the books that the federal government will have to take some action to relieve that pressure and disconnect of the federal illegality of marijuana.
Right. There's been so much damage from this. You look at the side effects of stop and frisk, the relationship with the community to the law enforcement community, if you will. In so many parts of the country, law enforcement is not seen as a positive. It's not seen as a part of the community that exists to provide protection and at some basic rule of law. And in so many places, it's seen as an invading community, an invading force, if you will, being dropped into the middle of the city, very often, particularly in urban areas, where, troglodytes like Sessions' insistence that the war on drugs is a moral and fine law, and that the folks who perhaps use cannabis and other drugs are somehow inferior to the folks who will get sloshed on gin and tonics at a connected restaurant or connected steakhouse in downtown Manhattan or in downtown DC. What type of, now you mentioned that you work primarily in a rural area, but what impact did the war on drugs have on the communities that you were involved in policing?
Well, because the area that I was in was depressed economically, there's a fairly thriving black market for drugs. It was also on main highway, north to south, near the Oklahoma on the Kansas border.
Mm-hmm.
So it lends itself to a distribution corridor.
Mm-hmm.
Really what I saw, though, at the personal level was people that were being picked up over and over and had a high incidence of recidivism. A lot of their charges had to do with low-level drug crimes, and that they just kept compounding on one another because they kept getting arrested for whatever they were doing. So I knew a number of men that their families were crushed and ruined. It's an issue that creates problems at the family unit level, and then if you take people out of society, it leaves a vacuum in other areas. And so it really, it's been detrimental more than positive from my personal experience.
The downward spiral, repeated involvement with law enforcement places you in terms of your life is often, can be argued, more damaging than the social use of a narcotic is itself. Particularly in the case of marijuana, where there is no tie whatsoever to addiction, it can be argued that being caught with it, quite frankly, is far worse than actually using it. Is that a fair statement?
I would agree. Yeah, I'd agree with that. The penalties for being caught are so severe. I'm looking at alcohol versus marijuana, again, disconnect of reality, between how those are enforced.
Mm-hmm.
It's just ridiculous. It makes no sense.
Right. And even those laws that are on the books for use against abuse of alcohol, for example, OUI, DUI, can often be less severe than being caught with personal allocations of cannabis. You just about have to kill someone with an automobile and literally find yourself in a case where you're involved in a vehicular manslaughter to be judged as less worthy and more prone to incarceration than you are for having a couple ounces of weed. Again, there seems to be a complete lack of perspective anywhere on this. It's madness. So I'd
agree with that.
Mm-hmm. Do you see any hope in this administration, in terms of turning the tide on this, or do you think they're just at some point so bogged down, both by their own trap and by their own other screw-ups? One would thought we were making progress a few years ago.
Yeah, I'd like to short your question just to, do I have any hope in the administration? Personally, probably shouldn't answer, very little for a variety of reasons, but I think unless there's some significant inflection point that the government will have to act upon, mm-hmm. I think that they'll keep their heads in the sand, let the states do their thing, and just not take up the issue of this, because they have so many other bigger issues at hand, and the things that are going to made, in my opinion, mm-hmm. But there's such significant issues that I think they'll just keep tabling marijuana legalization until they're forced to act. Could that be this administration? Mm-hmm. Possibly, right. But it's anybody's guess because it's just such a wild card.
Right. One could argue what happened in the suburbs of St. Louis should have been that inflection point. We've had guests on from the Goldwater Institute who pointed out quite aptly that at the time of those riots, there were actually two federal investigations, one into the causal nature and the subsequent interdiction by law enforcement, but there was also an investigation into the community's relationship with municipal courts and the law enforcement community that found that these overarching laws, many of which involved the social use of drugs, had created an environment so toxic that those riots were literally, dry tinder, just waiting for a spark mm-hmm. to happen. And given the financial relationship that is so cozy between law enforcement, particularly in the municipal level, and the courts, where these courts are seen as as a revenue generator, not as a function of justice, that that it was bound to blow, and it did. And yet we still see now, it's been what, 2 years? A year and a half, 2 years since those riots, we still see nothing happening at any level.
Well, beyond our government, creating the drug war and enacting all these laws that, that are creating more problems in society than fixing. Instead of, not just the laws, but during the rise of crack cocaine in the 80s, our government was complicit, from the studies that I've read and articles that I've read, in allowing further distribution of crack within minority communities. Started in South Central Los Angeles, and prioritizing their law enforcement, not going after the bigger fish, but the low-hanging fruit of substance abusers, low-level drug criminals, quote unquote, let's say. And so it's not just the application of poor law enforcement, but they've also created situations and dynamics that they've actually helped perpetuate the war on drugs from the other side. And that's political, that has to do with money and lobbying. A lot of this has to do with the industrial prison complex and having private prisons run for money. There's just so many groups that are aligned with law enforcement and perhaps even colluding to the point of them benefiting from shaping the laws. That's a huge disconnect within our law enforcement system.
Right. I mean, the term pipeline is often used by urban activists when they talk about the prison pipeline, where you've got, first of all, on the old traditional form of fighting drugs, from the Ad Council, you've got a tremendous amount of money at stake and available to large corporations who engage in these PSAs and engage in all these DARE and all these other programs where literally billions are spent and money is jingled out. Then, of course, you've got law enforcement being able to, using civil asset forfeiture, profit extensively and create almost a narcotic-like dependence, if you will, on, ironically, legal drug money to maintain the financial standards of individual police departments and to continue this arms race that we see taking place at the local community level. Then, of course, take it one step further, as you so aptly pointed out, and understand that there's money in those jails, that a booming population that's incarcerated, particularly on 3 strikes you're out style laws, where the incarceration is almost reflexive, combined with a failed probationary system in this country, where simple violations of your probation could put you back and turn you into a recidivist overnight and put you back in the community from which we should be trying to separate you from. There's money to be made there. So, maybe I was wrong in my early analogy when I talked about, the government tolerance for alcohol and cigarettes because of its financial rewards that await them. Perhaps maybe we've come full circle and we understand that we want to perpetuate the drug war and we want to perpetuate incarceration for low-level offenses because they can make one whole hell of a lot of money at it.
Well, that's absolutely a big part of it. And when you look at all the different pieces and put them all together in a string, it's really scary because people don't understand, what people see is what's in the popular press. They don't see, had experiences that I've had from the inside or, putting the big, larger picture together. But if you run the whole timeline, it's really scary. And, it points toward, an oppressive regime, if you will, just based on how everything's been put together over the years in the drug laws. We're the best country in the world in my mind. We have a free and open society. As you mentioned, we have to have rules and laws, otherwise pure anarchy. but we have to have reason and diligence in writing laws and applying those so that, we're not creating more problems than we're trying to solve. And right now, that's what's happening with the drug war.
Right. And by the way, for the record, I'm what you call a minarchist. I'm not an anarchist, I'm a minarchist. So I literally believe in a minimal amount of government necessary to maintain the most basic rule of law, because as anyone who's been listening to this conversation understands, the old canard is true, and the halls of justice be in the halls. When you look at the incidences of and the sheer volume, if you will, generated by efforts like stop and frisk or broken windows, you see, in fact, that those efforts are largely targeted at the inner city and minority communities that don't have the financial wherewithal to engage in the long-term legal struggle, if you will, to either prove innocence or at least extricate oneself from an initial interaction with law enforcement and avoid this sort of death spiral that so many people find themselves. Folks tend to think of, one conviction as, okay, well, that's their fault, they shouldn't have done it, and not looking at the long-term consequences of that. You talked about, being able to be hired. We're talking about being able to engage in public housing, or at a certain level being able to ever get credit and or private housing again. We're talking about fines that are disproportional, if you will, to the ability of a community to pay for them, and the failure to pay such fines on a timely basis often leads to license suspensions and other levels of fines, interest, and additional charges. It's truly, and this is my rhetoric, but from your perspective as having participated in law enforcement, is the term death spiral too strong a term? Is that too much hyperbole?
I think it is. I would say it may have been more appropriate in the 80s and 90s. We're definitely in a spiral. It's not a death spiral because it's not dire, do or die. But let me say, for me, for someone that's in the system that is becoming a victim of our drug laws, for them it's a death spiral.
Right.
So at the personal, individual level, it sure can be.
No, and that's what I was trying to point out. Once you get pulled into those series of events, how difficult is it to break yourself out?
Well, it depends on the situation, but I would say for those of color or in depressed economic areas, it will. They have a much higher propensity for it to spiral out of control, have a greater impact on their life. One of the reasons you mentioned just a minute ago was their ability to pay for appropriate and adequate legal services. That alone puts them at a disadvantage because they can't fight within the system for their rights because of a lack of resources. And so once you start having that occurrence and reoccurrence, and then you have that within a defined geographic area, it's just going to continue to gestate and create more problems.
Right.
But this is one of the most complicated thought areas that I've ever had to grapple with. And there's so many different nuances and areas that may not even be explored about the impact of our current drug laws and drug war. But things are changing. Things are changing slowly and methodically, but we are moving in the right direction. At some point, I believe we'll revamp our drug laws to make it more equitable to our current society.
Is it generational? And my words, not yours. Does a generation of opposition literally have to die out before we can reach that level of equity or fairness or appropriateness or even just reasonableness?
I think we measure that, and that's because, again, of reefer madness and the indoctrination that marijuana will make you go crazy and you'll kill others. So I dare say, for the generation that grew up with that, as that generation dies off, for lack of a better word, There's going to be fewer people that have that mindset. But more so than that, what I've been seeing directly for years now is that as marijuana has become more mainstream and more socially accepted, people that have an interest in experimenting with it, or maybe tried it years ago, they now have the ability to try it safely and understand what they're putting in their body versus just whatever you buy in the street. So, people's perception are changing rapidly. Marijuana is a very explosive topic on many levels and areas, but it's, this marijuana experiment that has been touted in Colorado for the last 7 years, it's working. It's been proven to work. It's been proven to work in other states. It's being proven to work in other countries now. And so, the dominoes are coming down as we can continue to show that it's a much better thing to legalize marijuana than continue to fight against it.
Right. The fascinating part to me, and it's a dark fascination, is that given the increase, if you will, on a street level, and the mainstream media is actually paying attention now on deaths related to the use of narcotics, is often directly tied to the use of doctored narcotics. A doctoring that would cease in large part to exist if in fact there was a legal, safe structure for buying these said illegal narcotics, wouldn't it?
Yes. The issues we're facing right now around opioid and the heroin epidemic, it's worse than I think it's ever been in the country.
Right.
It's a subject and topic that we need to talk about more, and we need to find a solution for, especially with synthetic drugs and other drugs coming out of China and Asia that who knows what's in them, and particularly fentanyl.
Right.
It's literally killing off thousands of people this year, tens of thousands.
Right.
And that's continued to be perpetuated by our drug laws and by how they're applied. And that's really a social justice issue. Heroin, like a handful of other hard drugs, incredibly hard to kick the habit on. And so once you're addicted, it's a continual cycle. One of the positive things that's been happening in the last year or two is that police departments, fire departments, and other community groups, they now have access to naloxone, which is the antidote for opioid overdose. And so for them to have that as a tool on hand is a huge step from where we were several years ago.
Right. And really, this is the role that an organization like LEAP needs to play, isn't it? I mean, ultimately, it comes down to trying to educate folks, both civilians, but also folks who are in, I'll call it the political class, the chattering class, who has so much outsized control over our laws and our justice system. And it's got to be very powerful for you as a former law enforcement officer to speak to truth to other members of law enforcement who really haven't just been able to, I'll call it, get educated or get religion, if you will, on these issues. How powerful is the legitimacy that you carry with you as someone who walked the beat in working with members of the existing law enforcement community?
Well, for me personally, I'm humbled. I'm humbled by the ability that I have and the opportunity that I've been given to speak out on this topic, as an authority, having formally applied the laws. Never expected myself to be an activist. That's evidently something I've turned into, which for me has been a fascinating ride and one that's, created a whole lot of great things in my life just by getting out and sharing information. But for me, it's personal gratification. You know, if I can see the light bulb go off in a person's face when I'm having a, you know, presentation, I've been successful. If I can plant some seeds of reasonable thought and understanding of some of the reasons why our drug war doesn't work, you know what, I've done my job for the day.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me personally, I want to see things change. And what's one of the great things about being a member of LEAP, as a former law enforcement officer, I'm generally respected in the same regard, and can really get in front of any audience, you know, just from that position.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really been, you know, a huge benefit to my life, and, you know, one that I'm very appreciative for.
Right, and I know as a libertarian activist, there are times when dealing with particularly the conservative element of the Republican Party that I can see the shades drawn down the minute I mention libertarian and cannabis, because, you know, their predefined notions, their predefined, I'll call it political bigotry that exists in this place, prevents them from really having an open mind. And you're able to, with your organization, essentially shatter that. And my hat's off to you, to the folks, to Judge Jim Gray, who's been on the show before. Tell us how folks can find out more about LEAP and more about you, and just, again, get some religion in terms of the realities, the real issues, getting beyond the outrage porn, getting beyond the hyperbole, getting beyond the rhetoric, and getting beyond, as importantly, the politics of self-interest that so dictate the daily affairs of the war on drugs.
So LEAP has a great website with a lot of resources. It's leap.cc, and that's an incredible place for people to start to understand what LEAP is, more of what we do, who we are, but also other deeper factors and issues within the drug war and you know, within the cause we've taken up. And you know, I encourage anyone listening, start talking. Talk to your friends, talk to your family, start the conversation, start doing some research, try to understand more the reality of, you know, the benefits and negatives of marijuana legalization, so that you can make a choice for yourself based on real evidence instead of, you know, hyperbole and outdated data and you know, other information.
No, and folks, you know, speaking on behalf of the Libertarian Party, we are going to be engaged in the next legislative session in a very, very highly aggressive, I'll call it attack, if you will, on Rhode Island's cannabis laws and drug laws. We speak to perhaps a slightly different perspective. We believe in the absence of regulation, we look to avoiding the sort of onerous taxes going forward that communities have placed on so many items. But at the same time, we share a common goal, which is personal choice, a life of self-determination, and if that involves the use of a product like cannabis, a natural product, in an environment that causes no harm to others, just like a glass of bourbon, a nice rare steak, or a big thick vanilla shake, you as a free man or woman have a right to engage in that, away from government interference and away from the threat of incarceration, government regulation, government taxation. And certainly you have the right to purchase that product in a safe, appropriate manner of your choice and not feel like you're pushed into the black markets or dangerous altered product that, quite frankly, is more dangerous to you than any of the invented maladies that the reefer madness crowd will have you believe will occur. And that's been the theme of tonight's show. Again, Jason Thomas, I want to thank you for joining us on such short notice tonight. He is with, it used to be called Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. They've rebranded themselves a little bit because their website is rich in content on a number of different levels and a number of issues related to law enforcement. So now that it is now the Law Enforcement Action Partnership. Again, that can be found at leap.cc. Jason Thomas, thank you for bringing truth to the streets of Providence. We really appreciate your input tonight.
Well, you're welcome, and thank you for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity.
And I hope if you get out here to New England at any time in the near future, you'll let us know, because folks with the power that you bring to your testimony, we need to have you here in person. We need to have folks from the organization here in person, really continuing the fight head on. So you're welcome out here anytime.
Awesome. Let me know how I can help. And,
All right.
Thanks again.